The mission was supposed to be over. High above Earth, two spacecraft drifted toward one another with extraordinary precision. One carried two astronauts, Neil Armstrong and David Scott. The other was an Agena target vehicle waiting in orbit. Docking them together had never been done successfully before. As the distance closed, the shapes aligned. Metal approached metal. Then came contact. Latches engaged, and the two vehicles became one. For a moment, everything looked exactly as planned. The first successful docking in space had just been achieved. The defining objective of the mission was complete. And yet, almost immediately, something about the view outside the windows felt wrong. The docked spacecraft began to roll. Not violently, not dramatically, just enough to notice. A slow rotation, a subtle movement that seemed out of place against the blackness beyond the glass. Inside Gemini, the crew watched their instruments. The combined vehicle continued turning. The achievement was still intact. Gemini remained attached to Agena. Nothing appeared broken. Nothing appeared catastrophic. But the roll did not stop. It continued. And slowly, certainty began to disappear. The first question was simple. Which spacecraft was causing it? The timing seemed obvious. The rotation appeared after docking. Before contact, Gemini had behaved normally. After contact, the combined vehicle was rolling. The explanation practically presented itself. Something connected to Agena must be wrong. That conclusion fit the visible evidence. It fit the sequence of events. It fit common sense. The astronauts still had options. If Agena was responsible, then separation could solve the problem. The mission had shifted from celebration to troubleshooting, but the path forward still appeared clear. Outside, the two spacecraft remained locked together. Inside, the instruments drifted a little faster. The roll became more noticeable. Control inputs were made. Responses were observed. Yet the behavior never fully matched what the crew expected. The motion seemed stubborn, persistent, as if something continued pushing. Still, the dominant explanation survived. Agena remained the prime suspect. And so, the decision was made. Undock. If the source of the problem existed inside the target vehicle, separating from it should restore stability. The solution seemed logical. The danger seemed identifiable. The crew released the connection. The two spacecraft pulled apart. And within moments, the entire explanation collapsed. The rotation accelerated. Not slightly. Dramatically. The moment Gemini separated from Agena, the spacecraft began spinning faster than before. The very action that should have solved the emergency had made it worse. Outside the windows, Earth and darkness started trading places at increasing speed. Blue. Black. Blue. Black. The cycle accelerated. If Agena had been responsible, this should not be happening. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. The source of the danger was not drifting away. It was still there. Inside Gemini. Suddenly, the crew faced a very different reality. They were no longer diagnosing a problem in another vehicle. They were trapped inside the vehicle, causing it. The spin continued to build. Attitude indicators drifted faster. Reference points became harder to track. Every second made observation more difficult. Every second made diagnosis more difficult. and every second made the next decision more important. The pressure came from more than the spacecraft itself. Rapid rotation affects the human body. Orientation becomes difficult. Visual references blur. Thinking becomes harder precisely when accurate thinking matters most. The crew needed answers, while the conditions around them actively reduced their ability to find those answers. The options that had existed only minutes earlier were disappearing. One by one, the spacecraft continued rotating. Faster. ... Faster. Faster. The image was simple and terrifying. A vehicle spinning through space with two astronauts trapped inside, trying to understand why before the spin overwhelmed their ability to respond. Somewhere aboard Gemini, a thruster had become stuck. It was firing continuously. An invisible force. No explosion. No dramatic structural failure. Just a steady push that never stopped. The spacecraft was obeying physics exactly as it should. The problem was that one command never ended. But identifying the cause and surviving long enough to act on that knowledge were not the same thing. The spin was still increasing. Normal control systems were no longer enough. Another option vanished. Then another. What remained was a system that had been reserved for something else entirely. The re-entry control system. The system meant for bringing the astronauts home. Using it would carry a cost. If they relied on those controls now, the mission could not continue. The historic objectives beyond docking would be over. The flight would have to end early. Yet by this point, the choice had become brutally simple. Preserve the mission. Or preserve the crew. Armstrong reached for the last remaining option. The re-entry thrusters fired. Commands were issued rapidly. The spacecraft responded. The spin began to slow. Not instantly. Not effortlessly. But enough. The blur outside the windows gradually eased. The instrument became readable again. The violent rotation that had threatened to overwhelm the crew finally began yielding to control. Earth stopped flashing past in frantic intervals. The spacecraft steadied. The emergency was not entirely over, but survival was no longer slipping away. The crew had identified the true source before control disappeared completely. Gemini stabilized. The astronauts were alive. The spacecraft remained functional, yet the mission itself had changed permanently. Using the re-entry system meant there was no realistic path forward. The flight would be aborted. The remaining objectives would be abandoned. The spacecraft that had made history only a short time earlier was now preparing to come home. That return lacked the triumph expected at launch, but it carried something more important. The crew returned safely to Earth, and the meaning of the entire mission shifted. At the beginning of the story, the docking appeared to be the climax. The moment everyone would remember. Two spacecraft joining together in orbit for the first time. A landmark achievement. By the end, the docking looked different. It had become the first chapter of another story entirely. The moment of success had concealed the first signs of danger. The roll began after the objective was achieved. The wrong explanation seemed convincing. The obvious solution made the emergency worse. And survival ultimately depended not on accomplishing the mission, but on recognizing that their original assumption was wrong before their remaining options disappeared. The image that endures is not merely two spacecraft docked together above Earth. It is the sight of Gemini spinning faster and faster through space, control slipping away, while its crew raced to identify the real source of the danger. The mission made history. But history was not what nearly defined Gemini 8. A shrinking set of choices did. And the reason the crew came home was that they found the correct answer before the spinning spacecraft took away their ability to act.